Hey, what's up?
Hey man, nothing much. We're about to start Bohemian Rhapsody. You want to join?
Gosh, that movie sucks.
It's nominated for 5 Oscars.
Yeah, including Best Actor for Rami Malek.
It's just another boring, formulaic biopic. I swear to God. Those movies are all... the... same.
What was that about?
I don't know. But let's finally find out how they wrote Fat-Bottomed Girls. Hey Pat. Yeah, you were right. The movie wasn't that great. We didn't even learn how they wrote Fat-Bottomed Girls.
No.
Guys, I can't talk right now. I'm working.
Whoa. He's working on some new type of video.
My God. Hello? Is this William YouTube? I got something you're gonna want to see.
Every year around Oscar season, you can expect at least a couple biopics to pick up some nominations, usually for acting awards. While these movies don't tend to stick around in the public consciousness, like how often do you hear people talking about Ray, they keep getting made, they keep making money, and they keep winning awards. The biographical film, also known as biographical picture or biopic, has been around since the beginning of cinema. In the silent era, there were biopics made about Beethoven, Babe Ruth, Christopher Columbus, and maybe most famously, Joan of Arc. In his book, Whose Lives Are They Anyway? The Biopic as Contemporary Film Genre, Dennis Bingham writes, biography first became a prestige item when Adolf Zukor presented Sarah Bernhardt as movie bait for middle-class audiences in 1912. And for the past century, biopics have straddled the line between crowd-pleasing mainstream fare and prestigious, important films. They're serious dramas featuring transformative performances by some of our finest actors, but they're also about subjects already famous and familiar to audiences and told in a straightforward, accessible way. A subject like Gandhi or Freddie Mercury carries with it the same level of brand awareness as, say, a movie about Legos or X-Men. But while there have been more biopics made than I can possibly count, there's a subcategory I want to focus on. Biopics about musicians. These fit together as their own group with their own set of tropes simply because certain elements appear in the lives of most famous musicians from the 20th century. A rise from obscurity to fame, the music industry, and the experiences of touring, recording albums, etc. While there were biopics about musicians like Cole Porter or Benny Goodman made in the 40s and 50s, the modern music biopic came into existence in the 1970s. In 1972, there was Lady Sings the Blues, about the life of Billie Holiday. In 1978, there was the Buddy Holly Story, and 2 years later, there was Coal Miner's Daughter, about the life of Loretta Lynn. All 3 of these movies either won or were nominated for Academy Awards for their lead performers. Over the next several decades, the frequency of music biopics increased, building to a sort of boom in the early 2000s. In the past 19 years, we've had Ray, Walk the Line, Straight Outta Compton, Get On Up, La Vie en Rose, Beyond the Sea, The Lovely, The Runaways, I Saw the Light, Notorious, All Eyes on Me, and most recently Bohemian Rhapsody, which is now the highest grossing biopic of all time. Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic, opens this summer, and it was just announced that the lead role has been cast in Stardust, the upcoming David Bowie biopic. The music biopic is bigger than ever and shows no signs of slowing down. And in general, I have no problem with the idea of music biopics. My issue is with the approach the vast majority of them take. See, when making one of these movies, I think there's one essential question that needs to be asked. What is the best way to tell the story of an amazing life? These are movies about amazing, unique people who lived amazing, unique lives. And for decades, the way Hollywood has chosen to tell the stories of those lives is with the same repetitive formula applied the same way to each person. So, let's break down that formula, shall we? Usually, the movie begins late in the subject's career, right before they go on stage for an iconic performance. Then it jumps back to their childhood, where some sort of tragedy occurs, maybe a sibling dies or a parent abandons them. Then once they're older, there's the moment of discovery, when they sing or play their instrument in front of strangers who are immediately blown away by their talent. And then suddenly, we jump to performances in front of adoring fans, the scene where they record their first song and have to win over a cynical producer, the moment that song becomes a radio hit, and then we're on tour. This is where the film goes really heavy on the montages, and we have montages of touring, becoming successful, womanizing, stuff like that. Now, we get to the point where they start innovating and pushing their music forward, which tends to coincide with them starting to take drugs. There are more montages, their marriage becomes strained due to the cheating and the drug use, and then we hit the dark period. They alienate the people closest to them, are rarely sober, and usually eventually go to rehab. Then they clean up, get back to the music, play a big, amazing concert, and it ends on a freeze frame. Did I get it all? Is that everything? Oh, and then there's always some text telling us what happened to them in the remaining years of their life.
I'll turn it inside out.
Well, I'm going.
Formulas are a complete and utter waste of time.
Formulas work. Let's stick with the formulas. I like formulas.
One could argue that this is simply telling what happened in the person's life, and it is. But there's a difference between summarizing events and telling a story. The film Ray ends with Ray Charles going to rehab for drug addiction, and then the text tells us that he never took drugs again. If you just look at the ending, you'd think the focus of the film was Ray Charles' battle with drugs. But it's not. That's just a small part of it. But because the biopic formula is so rigid, the filmmakers have crammed his life story into it and tried to make it fit. And what we're left with is a story that doesn't seem to have a point, a shallow 2-hour summary of Ray Charles' life. The film has to end with some kind of victory, and so here, the victory is over drug addiction. By adhering to this formula and trying to fit so many decades of a person's life into a single film, it almost always does the story a disservice. You can tell that the filmmakers want to include as many noteworthy events as possible, but the more they try to fit in, the less time and attention each one receives. It ends up skimming the surface of the story, leaping from one event to another, alternating montage with musical performance with dialogue scene. Difficult subjects like drug addiction or domestic abuse become predictable tropes that arrive around the same point in every film. After a pretty compelling first hour, the latter half of Straight Outta Compton turns into a checklist of events. Snoop Dogg shows up, Tupac shows up, Ice Cube writes the screenplay for Friday, Dr. Dre's first solo album is reduced to a billboard on screen for 4 seconds, Eazy-E dies 6 minutes after his AIDS diagnosis. In order to fit the full span of events into 2 hours, the narrative is simplified to a cartoonish degree. It's why every musician seems to do one public performance and immediately is on a sold-out tour. It's why one moment of inspiration
You can't walk no line.
cuts to a hit song already written.
Because you're mine, I walk the line.
There's a part in Straight Outta Compton where we see NWA being harassed by police officers, and then the film cuts right to them recording Fuck the Police.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground.
Now, I'm not saying I need a scene where Ice Cube sits alone and writes the lyrics, but it would be nice if the film cared just a little bit about the creative process. Bohemian Rhapsody wildly alters actual history in order to fit into the formula. In the film, Freddie Mercury tells the rest of Queen about his AIDS diagnosis when trying to convince them to reunite for the Live Aid performance, when in reality, he didn't get the diagnosis until 2 years later. But who cares, as long as the film can have a triumphant final performance in the face of impending death. And then also make it seem like Queen was solely responsible for raising all the money to help Africa. The formula becomes a sort of biopic Mad Libs. Just fill out the list and you've got a new movie. What childhood tragedy? What drug are they addicted to? Which family member doesn't believe in them? What location does their inevitable meltdown happen in? It might sound like I'm being flippant about people's actual lives, but that's what these movies have done. They've turned real people's complicated lives into cliches. I don't want to roll my eyes when I see yet another scene of a strung-out husband screaming at his wife in front of a crying baby, but this is where we are. The most interesting of the classical music biopics are the ones from earlier in the genre's development, back around the late 70s. Last week when I watched the Buddy Holly story, it was a shock to see that the story began with his band already together and playing gigs. If this were made now, we'd probably get 20 minutes of material before that point, showing Buddy Holly as a kid learning to play guitar. And you know what? I didn't miss it. As tragic as it is that Buddy Holly's life was cut short at the age of 22, it gives the film a far more manageable period of time to cover. It allows the storytelling to play out as actual connected events instead of feeling like a 2-hour montage. Holly develops an actual relationship with a woman instead of meeting her and then the film cutting to them getting married. It still checks a lot of the classic biopic boxes, but there's a stronger than usual emotional through line. We can see something similar in Coal Miner's Daughter, which devotes its entire first half to telling Loretta Lynn's story from before her music career began. She doesn't pick up a guitar until 47 minutes into the movie. When her career finally does take off, there is far more emotional weight than in most similar films, since they devoted the time to making us care about her as a person. It's the moment the artist's career takes off and they start touring that the audience, or at least I do, tend to disengage a little bit, as the film starts rapidly moving forward with lots of montages. So even though it's a work of fiction and not a biopic, the same thing kinda happens in A Star is Born. The first half so delicately handles the characterization and the main relationships, and once the fame arrives and the plot starts rapidly moving forward, I felt my connection to the film wane slightly. I like the second half, just not as much as the first half. What's strangest about most music biopics is how little attention is paid to the music. Sure, we get plenty of scenes where the protagonist performs songs, and the required scene where they discover their unique sound in a recording session and blow away the jaded producer, but rarely is any time given to their creative process, their musical evolution, their growth as an artist, or what drives them to make music in the first place. The music is simply presented as a given, a thing that's always there, that always seems to arrive fully formed. Bohemian Rhapsody, one of the few music biopics to actually show some of the creative process, still simplifies it to cartoonish levels. A band member will play a riff or a beat, then the film will cut straight to them performing the finished song.
You got blood on your face, a big disgrace.
This is how the songwriting process is portrayed.
Oh, that's really good.
I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I feel like the stories behind the creation of some of the most iconic pieces of music of the past century are more interesting than, say, another montage of them touring America and having affairs with random women, or like the origin of the Bye Felicia meme. If I had to diagnose a singular problem with all these music biopics, it's that they don't know what they want to say or what story they want to tell. There seems to be the idea that because these are great people, their stories need to be handled in a way that is respectable, that showcases all the struggles and triumphs, that it needs to encompass their entire life in order to express how great they were. But at the end of most of these movies, the only real idea that has been expressed is, this person went through a lot and was really great. Instead of stories, these feel like cinematic Wikipedia articles.
Pat, have you seen? You're blowing up! Top of the charts, baby!
And I'm taking it even further.
Watch out, beauty pie! Woo!
Guys, I feel like this isn't enough. This video is getting stale. I need to push things further. I need hotter takes.
Well, I think I have just what the doctor ordered.
It's Adderall and heroin.
There's another element that can't be overlooked when it comes to biopics, and that's that most of them are made with the approval or involvement of either the subject themselves or their estate. So basically, in almost every case, even the best cases, we're getting a portrayal that has been checked by people with a stake in the story to make sure the picture being painted is a flattering one. I mean, in Straight Outta Compton, Ice Cube is a producer and his own son literally plays him. This doesn't always visibly affect the final product, but then sometimes it does, like in Bohemian Rhapsody, which has 2 members of Queen as executive producers. It's a safe bet that this is partly responsible for some of the baffling editing, which cuts frantically to make sure each band member has an equal number of close-ups, even when it harms the rhythm of the scene. Are some of the story choices in which the non-Freddie Mercury members of the band are portrayed as the responsible, hard-working ones, leaving parties early to be with their families, and always showing up to the studio on time, while Freddie is the only one to live a rock star lifestyle and constantly lets down the rest of the band. So I'm not saying we should dismiss every music biopic as revisionist history, since that's not the case, but this is just something to keep in mind next time you watch one. The music biopic, as we know it, should have died in 2007, because that was the year that Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, was released, directed by Jake Kasdan and co-written by Kasdan and producer Judd Apatow. There have been plenty of parody films made over the years, from Blazing Saddles to Airplane to Austin Powers, but I've never seen one so thoroughly demolish an entire genre. Walk Hard tells the story of fictional country musician Dewey Cox, and around him creates a biopic that satirizes every single trope of the genre. It starts, like so many others, with the present-day framing device where
Dewey Cox needs to think about his entire life before he plays.
And then works its way through the biopic formula, checking off every single box along the way. There's the childhood tragedy, the disapproving parents, the disapproving first wife, the moment of discovery, the recording session where the cynical producer is won over, the montages of touring and having affairs, the drug addiction, the violent freakout, the appearances by other famous musicians, and so on. And of course, it ends with a freeze frame and text. What makes Walk Hard special is that beyond just the formula, it nails the look and feel of a biopic. Everything that's happening in it is ridiculously silly, but it's shot like a serious prestige picture. It's so specific in its lampooning of biopic tropes that after watching it, it's very hard to take one of these movies seriously. Once you've seen Dewey Cox tearing a sink out of a wall, it's hard not to laugh when Johnny Cash does it. Once you've seen Dewey Cox freaking out in rehab, it's hard not to laugh when Ray Charles does the same thing. The key thing that Walk Hard understands is the self-importance of the music biopics. The belief that this is an important story about an important person. And also, the music slaps.
But I still got a dream and a burning race to live. Walk hard.
But tragically, Walk Hard flopped hard when it was released. It barely made half its budget back, no one saw it, I mean I did, but the theater was empty, and it quickly disappeared from theaters. If it had been a hit, one could imagine it having some kind of cultural impact. Maybe more filmmakers would think twice before making another formulaic biopic. But instead, in the decades since then, we've gotten Get On Up, which begins with James Brown needing to think about his entire life before he plays, or Bohemian Rhapsody, which just feels like a remake of Walk Hard without jokes. So Hollywood, if you're listening, please, can you make it a rule that every filmmaker needs to watch Walk Hard before making another music biopic? Thanks. The appeal of a biopic lies in seeing an actual person who did something interesting in life, known mostly in public, transformed into a character. This is the power of a biopic, even a bad one. It recontextualizes events with which we're already familiar as a part of a character's story. So Queen's Live Aid performance isn't just a great performance, it's now the culmination of an emotional arc, the last hurrah of a life about to be cut tragically short, and a celebration of victory over years of struggle. While it rings false to me, and I cringe at the warping of facts to force the story into an obvious formula, I recognize why it works for so many people, and why these kinds of movies continue to succeed. So even though they're formulaic and predictable, audiences really just want to see these people come alive, and these stories be told. I know multiple people who were moved to tears by Bohemian Rhapsody, and they're not wrong for reacting that way. I get it. I just think there's a better way to tell these stories. Get On Up, the 2014 James Brown biopic, tries to innovate the format with a non-linear structure and occasional fourth wall breaks. But instead of feeling unique, it still hits every music biopic cliche and just comes across as the usual thing with the scenes in a different order. The fourth wall breaks are an interesting idea that don't quite work, since the movie doesn't commit to them. They only happen once every 30 minutes or so, and there's no narration in between, so they feel jarring each time they happen. To see what Get On Up wants to be, you have to step away from music biopics. Sugar cereal. Drugs. I need more.
No, what you need to do is slow down.
If I slow down, how am I supposed to finish the video? You stupid idiot!
We just wanted to snort some Adderall, shoot a little heroin, and have a nice chill evening. And now Jake's upset, and frankly, I'm pretty worked up as well.
No, Pat, no! You're hurting me. Ah! You're too much dead weight. I don't need you.
You're no longer the roommate I fell in love with.
If we're talking about biopics that span a decade or more, there's one filmmaker who's proved over and over again that he knows how to make it work. And that's Martin Scorsese, a guy who, is pretty good at making movies. In Raging Bull, Goodfellas, The Aviator, and The Wolf of Wall Street, Scorsese tells stories following real-life protagonists through decades of their lives. Also, Kundun, which I know I saw once, but can't remember at all. These are all biopics with linear timelines, but they're entertaining and exciting when most others are dull and formulaic. In each case, what separates Scorsese's biopics from the hordes of mediocre ones is that he doesn't try to fit a person's entire life into one movie. Instead, he picks a specific story to tell. Let's look at The Aviator, maybe the most traditional of Scorsese's biopics. It even does the classic biopic move of beginning with the person as a child. This is a movie about Howard Hughes, a guy who did so much, who had such an insane, fascinating life, that it would take a whole series of movies to cover it all. But Scorsese is focused on one specific thing, the idea of obsession, and primarily how it manifests through Hughes' love of aviation. The brief scene of Hughes as a child is there to set up his obsessive germophobia, which would grow throughout his life and become particularly debilitating during the period covered in this film. But then the story jumps ahead to Hughes in production on his first movie, Hell's Angels, and it specifically focuses on his obsessive commitment to perfecting the scenes with airplanes. Instead of the usual biopic that feels like one big montage, by focusing strictly on Hughes' growing obsession, his worsening OCD, and the connection between those and his work and relationships, Scorsese crafts a film that feels like an actual story, not a shallow summary of a life. The opening section is devoted to the production of Hell's Angels, then Hughes' relationship with Katharine Hepburn, then his increased focus on airplane innovation, and then his battle with the US government and struggle to finish The Spruce Goose. Even when the story is taking big leaps forward in time, there's always a primary goal or obstacle in sight. The film ends with Hughes' obsession having given him a great professional victory while taking a devastating toll on his personal life and the functioning of his mind. The Aviator is not the story of Howard Hughes, it is a story about Howard Hughes, and that's why it works.
But I need to do something different. Do you know what I mean? I need to grow.
What we can learn from Scorsese is to pick the approach that best suits the subject, instead of conforming the history of their life to a rigid formula. And this is what the very best music biopics do. Most biopics try to explain their subject, drawing simple conclusions about how their personal life influenced their career. Clint Eastwood's film Bird, about the life of Charlie Parker, understands that there are no easy explanations. It avoids the cliche biopic moments, instead hopping backward and forward through time, giving glimpses of Parker's life and letting the viewer draw their own conclusions. This might sound silly, but the loose, non-linear structure of the movie feels like a good representation of Parker's music. With I'm Not There, Todd Haynes recognized that Bob Dylan is something of an enigma, a man who has reinvented himself and his music countless times over the past 50 years. Telling his story as a traditional biopic with a traditional narrative would be virtually impossible and pointless. So Haynes took a more abstract approach. His film is split into 7 sections, with an ensemble of actors portraying different ideas of Bob Dylan that are more inspired by him and his life than trying to tell a story about his life. The very conceit of the movie acknowledges that it's impossible to pinpoint exactly who Bob Dylan is. And look, I recognize that I'm Not There is very much an art house film that is never going to be a mainstream hit, so I'm not insisting that every music biopic be an abstract, dreamlike film. So a more accessible, direct approach that I think more filmmakers should look to is the one used in Love and Mercy, the 2014 film about the life of Brian Wilson. Love and Mercy picks 2 specific periods in Wilson's life and focuses on those, cutting back and forth between them. There's the period in the 1960s when Wilson is making the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds, and the period in the 80s when the woman who will become his second wife helps him escape the control of the therapist who had taken over his life. This is all one story about Wilson's musical genius and his mental deterioration, and there's a clear connection between the 2 halves of the film. Because it's so specific in its focus, we actually get to understand who Brian Wilson was. Instead of reducing his creative process to a cartoonish, get idea, cut to hit song narrative, we see him struggling to create and express himself. We see the actual work happen. It's the rare biopic that is actually interested in the artist and how they made the music.
Okay, let's cut, please. Okay, so try it more staccato, okay? You guys are the rhythm now.
After watching so many of these movies in which all the hit songs show up fully formed, it feels like a miracle to watch Wilson's frustration as he tries to create good vibrations.
I have this song playing over and over in my head, I just don't have the words or the melody.
This is basically a variation on what I call the Lincoln approach, in reference to Steven Spielberg's 2012 movie about Abraham Lincoln. In most cases, a biopic is going to be more compelling and allow for much greater depth if it focuses on a specific period of a person's life, instead of trying to fit their whole life story into one movie. Like, I will go on the record and say if Bohemian Rhapsody had just built the entire movie around, say, the recording and release of A Night at the Opera, or maybe the Live Aid performance, it would be much, much better than the thing they actually made.
Oh, I'm so cold. This video has brought me nothing but misery. Pat, Jesus Christ, man. Hey, listen, you're gonna be okay? We're gonna get through this, bud. You don't need to chemically alter your brain to make great videos. We just have to find that old magic. The magic that's been inside of you this whole time. Okay. Come on, Pat. Let me do it! I can do it. Come on. Time to finish editing. Yes. Zoom in. Select clip. Let's put some music in there.
Look, every filmmaker or aspiring filmmaker has their personal list of dream movie projects that they do morally questionable things to get to make. I know I've got mine. And on that list, there is just one music biopic, and it's one I've thought about off and on for more than a decade. Since I was in middle school, I've been an obsessive fan of the band Oasis. I'm not entirely sure how, since I was only vaguely aware of them during their mid-90s peak, but over the years I've listened to every B-side and demo, read every interview with Liam and Noel Gallagher, and watched the amazing documentary Supersonic multiple times. Basically, by now I have a pretty good grasp on the band's narrative, especially from the most important years of 1993 through 1997. And this is a narrative that could make an incredible movie, or multiple incredible movies. It's the story of 2 brothers who bring out the best and worst in each other, who go from high school dropouts on welfare to the biggest band in the world in about 4 years, and behave very badly the whole time. I mean, it's a good enough story that it was used as the backstory for one of the main characters on Lost. And if you're telling that story, I get the impulse to include all the fun stuff, like the war with Blur, or the time Noel briefly quit the band on their American tour, or when Liam bailed on their MTV Unplugged show and heckled Noel from the balcony, or when they played the biggest concert in British history, and those all just happened in the span of 2 years. But if you put that whole period of time in a movie and end it at the giant concert, What story are you actually telling? What are you saying about these people? Wow, those guys sure did become very successful and behave very badly. So we return to the same two things every person making a biopic needs to ask themselves. Number one, what story do I want to tell about these people? And number two, am I doing anything Walk Hard did? So if I'm making an Oasis biopic, the obvious thing to focus on is the relationship between Liam and Noel Gallagher. It's that tension, that knowledge that they need each other even if they don't like each other, that is the heart of the band, and it's what needs to drive any movie about them. So here's what I would do. Start the story right after Nebworth, the biggest concert in British history and the pinnacle of their success, and begin with the MTV Unplugged show, a big televised display of the tension between the brothers. Then have the movie cover the following year, late 1996 through 1997. Tell the story of the recording and release of their third album, Be Here Now, the fastest selling album in British history that was also an overblown, excessive drug-fueled monstrosity that pretty much killed the 90s Britpop movement. In this one year, you get the story of the biggest band in the world spiraling out of control. It's both a transition period and the end of something. It's the best of times and the worst of times, and the core relationship is right at the heart of it. Plus, you get the part where Noel gets invited to 10 Downing Street to meet Tony Blair and does cocaine in the bathroom, which is just fun. Anyway, I just came up with that in like half an hour. It's not that hard to figure out how not to do another boring, formulaic biopic. And I know it's probably not going to happen for another 20 years or so, but whenever the inevitable Oasis movie gets made, Hollywood, hit me up. I've got this figured out. Thanks, guys. You know, despite what I said earlier, I couldn't have done it without you. So what do you say? Let's get burritos?
Yes, that's my first boy, dude. Woo! Yeah, let's do it. And you know I'm getting the shrimp burrito. That's what I'm doing.
You ever wish life worked like music biopics, where you have an idea and then it just cut to the amazing finished product? Well, life doesn't work that way. You still have to do the work, but if you want to get better at that work, you should check out Skillshare, our sponsor for this week's video. Skillshare is the place to go if you want to get better at everything from writing to video production to graphic design to business. Yeah, even business. They've got thousands of classes taught by experts and professionals. And if you sign up at the link in the description, you get 2 months totally free, but it's only available to the first 500 people. Since I've spent the past half hour talking a lot about structure and character development, I recommend checking out the Writing Academy courses by Steve Alcorn. In particular, the one on structuring your story. And honestly, a lot of the people writing these biopics should check it out too. So again, the first 500 people to sign up at the link below get 2 months of Skillshare for free. And hey, maybe with the skills you learn, you'll make something so good that one day there will be a formulaic biopic made about you. I mean, probably not, but it could happen.